Hi, TheCinemaRanger here on a beautiful cold fall day. Last night I saw Dr. Sleep and I found this hedge maze here. It seemed like a good place to do a bit of an analysis of that film, although today I'm also going to do a critique. But without further ado, let's get in there and see if we can get lost. Just like, Danny and Jack in The Shining. When it comes to Dr. Sleep, I think, the place to start with an analysis of that is to take a look at the main theme, which is addiction. And that idea is played throughout the film. There's a lot of different motifs of addiction. It's pretty obvious, really. Nothing to get too hung up on there. If there is one, I think, very fascinating aspect of the theme of addiction, it's probably in the character of Rose the Hat. And I'll talk about her more later because I want to do a bit of a critique of this film. But she's interesting in the sense that pretty early on she finds out about this Abra character and decides to go after her, but she also finds out pretty quickly on just how powerful Abra is, and yet she can't bring herself to stop going after this little girl. That to me is the most interesting part of the addiction theme, that Rose herself sort of showcases the power of addiction to cause us to make bad decisions. I think a couple of other interesting themes the film wrestles with are, for one, overcoming childhood trauma, and this idea that when we're healthy, when we've healed, when we've grown up, we're no longer sort of burdened with the same kind of fears that we were as a child. It's really compelling to me the way that Danny goes back to the Overlook, and he doesn't go back with any great sense of trepidation or anxiety. He goes back with a sense of clarity and confidence. He's untroubled by the ghosts of his past and the monsters of his past, and he tackles those things pretty readily. He's beaten those monsters, and he's ready to go back and face them. Another theme is, pretty common one in a lot of movies these days, but, the power of technology in our lives. At one point we see Abra throw her phone out of a car window. It's talked about numerous times by the coven of soul vampires, how perhaps cell phones and TV and other things are sort of sapping the shining away from people. So, nothing terribly original there, but I think the film also wrestles with this idea that technology and our reliance on technology is in some way making us less interesting as people. But now I'm going to get to the critique of the film, because unlike some of the other films that I've analyzed so far, there were a number of flaws that really troubled me with this movie, and I thought it was so close to being a great film, but ultimately it just missed some critical errors. We go back to Rose. While she is this fascinating symbol of addiction, at the price of that thematic clarity comes a kind of weakness in her character. The first time she has a showdown with Abra, she loses that showdown pretty handily. And I never, recover from there in a sense. She never feels like a truly threatening figure. No one in that coven of psychic vampires, or whatever you want to call them, they never feel especially threatening. They feel outmatched by Abra, and they feel outmatched even by Danny. And so on that level, there's kind of a failing. She's an interesting villain, but she's interesting thematically because she represents addiction. But she also represents sort of the weakness of addiction, the depravity of addiction. The idea that addiction takes us to places where we know we're going to lose and can't resist going there anyway. Narratively, that's a bit of a dud, especially when you consider how terrifying Jack was in the original Shining, how powerful he felt in that film, how controlling he felt. I think there's a missed opportunity there. Speaking of Abra, I think that's a character that also could have benefited from a little bit more work. She's interesting enough in terms of really developing the franchise in some new directions, but as a character herself, she was a little flat, not much drama there, not much internal conflict. And I also think that, given the fact that the original Shining was so preoccupied with the idea of family, that the concepts of family are brought up in this Dr. Sleep film, that it might have made more sense if she was the cook's daughter or granddaughter. As a character related to the original story, she would have fit in a little bit better. And plus it would have motivated the appearance of the cook in Danny's visions a little bit more as well, and his role would have been improved by that as well. We would see the cook having a lineage that had just as much value as anything Danny and Jack and Wendy brought to the scene. Another part of the film that's simultaneously brilliant but also fails to resonate is the moment where Danny meets his father Jack. And overall I thought the casting was pretty solid, trying to recover some of these classic characters with new faces. And that scene, you know, if it doesn't work, it's not because of the acting. But, you know, Danny's there talking to his father, and there's this incredibly interesting, compelling moment where the two of them talk about just how overwhelming family is. How it takes our time, how it eats us up, how it consumes us. It's another main theme in the film, this theme of consumption and being devoured by things like a maze. And, you know, it's a great idea, but Danny really has no family. He doesn't have kids. And the family we do see with Abra seems to be a very, very functional family. And so these concepts of being consumed by children, by work, by modern life, they kind of fall on deaf ears a little bit when the protagonist is himself not wrestling with them. If Danny had had a wife and kids and had been struggling, sort of handling these things, and had been using his addiction as sort of an escape from them, in that moment where he confronts the father, having himself wrestled with those same issues, it sure would have resonated much more strongly. It would have been a pretty powerful moment in the film. So definitely think a real missed opportunity there to develop Danny on a path that reminds us much more of his father's struggles than ultimately he does. Bringing this thing full circle, you know, let's just keep talking about missed opportunities with Danny as a character. Because again, I have mixed feelings about this film. I'll explain the positives in a minute. But with Danny, at the end of the film, you know, he pulls back the shower curtain. He's back in room 237. He's sort of been possessed by the ghosts. And there's this incredible opportunity to change up the scenario, to give us something different when the shower curtain pulls back. We've seen the naked old lady a lot of times now. We saw the original Shining, we saw her plenty there, and she's revisited in this film as sort of a boogeyman that Danny easily conquers. So when she's brought back at the end, there's nothing there. We already know he can beat her. There's nothing threatening or treacherous, and maybe that harkens back to the idea of overcoming childhood trauma, but to me, there's a real missed opportunity. If the first Shining was an exploration of the monstrosity of an abusive father, it seems to me that this second visitation to the film could be an exploration of the son's relationship to a mother, because after all, in abusive situations, children have feelings towards both parents, both the abuser and the abused. It would make a lot of sense for Danny to be resentful or frustrated or angry with his mother simply for failing to be as much of a mother as she could be, for not standing up to Jack earlier, for not recognizing that Danny's father was an abusive maniac. She had those opportunities in her life and she didn't do them. And as Danny grows old and falls into his own path, his own resentments, I think it would make a lot of sense for him at some point to maybe develop anger, frustration, and disappointment with his mother. I guess what I'm getting at is that was a moment there in pulling back the shower curtain that, and rather seeing just that naked old lady again, if his mother had been there, and maybe it was just her face being devoured by flies, or maybe it was Danny confronting the fact that he had all this repressed anger towards her for being so passive, for being so meek, until it was almost too late. But there it is, just another monster, kind of a holdover from Stephen King in a real way. And to be quite honest, I think that this movie excels when Stephen King is not present. You know, when it comes down to it, there were parts of this movie that I flat out loved. And what's interesting about this film, it's a bit of a Frankenstein job. You know, there's parts which kind of sell out and are easy and choppy and, you know, sort of simplistic narrative, missed opportunities. But then there's other parts which are downright chilling and just hold you in thrall. And those parts are the moments in the film where you can just feel the ghost of Kubrick hovering over things. The music, the heartbeats, the aerial shots of roads and cars on lone roads, that beautiful shot of the lake, the mountain road, the methodical dialogue where the characters have this deliberate, sort of agonizingly slow way of speaking to each other, and just those slow-paced shots and those slow dissolves, all these things that are things that Kubrick did in The Shining. When the director replicates those moments and puts them in the film is incredibly effective. You know, there were moments where I'm like, this is a masterpiece. And then, you know, it would escape the ghost of Kubrick and sort of fall back into its contemporary mores, and we'd be left with less of a film than I think a lot of us wanted. So, in a way, that's maybe the film's truest assessment of itself, because it's really devoted to this idea that we don't leave. We pass on, we become ghosts, but we're not gone, as the characters say at several points in the film. And I think what's interesting is that you're watching this film, you know, the most sort of important ghost that hangs over all of it is Kubrick himself. The shadow of his incredible work is the best parts of this film, and they still work really, really well. And I think that's just a testament to his brilliance as a filmmaker and the effect he's had on culture in general. I don't know how to get out of here. Well, I'll just figure it out. I'm the Cinema Ranger. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope our paths cross someday. By the way, just a reminder, if you like this film, I'd please encourage you to subscribe so that you can get updates about my latest videos. I hope to do one every week, and pretty soon here I plan to do a retrospective where I, you know, move into some older films. I say that, of course, assuming that I'll ever escape, which at this point is a bold assumption. Take care of yourselves.